All right, so here we are once again with British literature from roughly the end of the 18th century down to the present time. And this evening we're going to be talking about the Victorian issues, which of course continue in most cases in one form or another down to our own time. And this is going to lead us into a discussion of the term paper. And these, you will recall, are the topics for the term paper. Remember, I said all the way back at the beginning of the course that I wanted you to investigate one of the so-called Victorian issues. We have a whole section in our anthology dealing with this. These issues are, first of all, evolution, which, of course, was the principal science. It was not the only science, by the way, that was controversial in the 19th century. But the Darwinian theory of evolution became especially controversial, and there were those who felt that it contradicted the literal reading of the Bible and therefore provided our culture with a kind of conflict between religion and science. And whether there was, in fact, such a conflict or not, there was, from a cultural point of view, such a conflict in the sense that many people believed that there was such a conflict. So, in some ways, that continues to the present time, in ways that we'll talk about as we go along. The second one of our great issues is the whole question of industrialization. And is industrialization really something that has brought about great progress, or has it brought about a kind of cultural decline? In other words, we all would agree that we have accomplished great things through industrialization, urbanization, scientific advancement, and technology. On the other hand, have we paid a very high price, and some might even say too high a price, because of the way in which we have conducted this industrial revolution? And of course, we're going to see that there are all kinds of debates that went on, and some of this we've already touched on because, at least by implication, many of the Romantics are really providing a critique of urbanization and its attendant industrialism. We'll come back to that in a few moments. And then, of course, we have what in the Victorian age was somewhat quaintly called the woman question. The woman question. And, of course, what we have, beginning among a very small number of women in the 18th century, but an increasingly large and vocal group of women in the 19th century, and then on into the 20th century as well, who are arguing for and even demanding equality, especially equality of opportunity for women. And that's something that we're going to be looking at in some detail, not only through some of the selections that we have in our text, but these are issues that we're going to be continuing to discuss as we take up future writers in the coming weeks. Now, in addition to that, I have also offered an optional topic which would deal with literature that represents the colonial or post-colonial experience in the old British Empire. Colonial experience would be obvious, right? That people either living in the colonies or knowing about the colonies or having some experience in the old British colonies and writing about that experience often had very interesting things to say, many of them, by the way, critical of the colonialism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. Since those colonies have become independent, those former colonies have become independent, many of the peoples in those cultures now regard themselves as living in a kind of post post-colonial situation. And what does that mean? What kinds of complexities are involved in that as a people attempts to try to emerge out of the identity, the cultural identity it had as a colonial member of the British Empire, into developing some kind of new identity for itself, which of course is never going to abandon entirely the old identity, but may build on that and adapt that in all kinds of ways in forming a new cultural and even national identity. So we'll talk about these issues in particular as we go along. But what I'm asking you to do is to choose one of these great cultural issues that began in the 19th century and, of course, continued well through the 20th century and are still with us in one form or another at the beginning of the 21st century. So, what you will do, question.
On the term paper, you said that could be an alternate topic from someone from the old colonial period or whatever. And under the Victorian issues, you said that we could do evolution, industrialization, or the woman question.
Right.
What kind of topics apply to the other alternative topic, if we were to choose?
The one having to do with colonial or post-colonial experience?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Well, we're going to be reading, for example, Conrad's Heart of Darkness, which is all about white Europeans in black Africa and the experience mainly of the white Europeans from the European point of view in a former European colony in Africa. That work has been very controversial, by the way, and we're going to also be looking at a critique by a famous African novelist and intellectual of Conrad's novel. So what I'm getting at is here's a literary work that deals directly with that issue. Or when we get to Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, one of the things that people usually think of when they take up Mrs. Dalloway is, quote, the woman question, right? Because much of the work is about the identity of women in relation to men. And remember, this is something that I talked about earlier, that you can't really talk about female identities completely independently of male identities because we all live in the same society and there clearly are going to be some kinds of relations among these different efforts to form different kinds of identities. So that's one thing that's going to be pretty obvious when we talk about that novel. But another thing that comes up, not as the major part of the novel, but certainly as an important theme in the novel, is the relationship between England and one of its most important colonies at the time, which was India. And it would be interesting for somebody actually to look at how that is treated in the novel. And there are lots of others. You know, some of you may be familiar with E.M. Forster's novel Passage to India, which again is about the experience of the British in India. But Forster, though he is a British person and writer himself, attempts at any rate to give some account of what this meant to Indians from their perspective. There are certainly also people who are Indian writers or African writers or Asian writers who have written about that kind of experience from their point of view. And now, as we have moved into a post-colonial period, post-colonial in the political sense that these former colonies are no longer colonies of the old empire, but they are now independent nations, such as South Africa and Nigeria and India and so on and so on and so on and so on around the world. And what are writers in these countries now doing with the post-colonial experience of being former members of the British Empire who are now working to forge a cultural identity of their own? And that's a very, very interesting kind of problem. And some of our most interesting literature, as a matter of fact, is literature dealing with colonial and or post-colonial experience. So that's an optional fourth title, and it's a topic, And even though it's not listed in our textbook under Victorian issues, it's an issue that began to come up particularly in the 19th century, and then, of course, it gained great momentum during the 20th century. Does that answer your question? Do you think? Pretty close?
Example, if I was, let's say if I was to take Chinua Achebe, one of his books,
Right.
and I'm going to have to write about either evolution or industrialization or the woman question or something like that.
Or the colonial or post-colonial experience as represented in his work. Okay? I mean, he's an African writer who lives in and writes from the experience of living in an African country that is a former British colony. And so if you were to take that fourth optional topic, that would be the focus of your attention. Now, it doesn't have to be. I mean, one could certainly take an Indian writer and talk about, quote, the woman question. Or a British writer living in India and talking about that. For example, Passage to India would be a very interesting project for talking not simply about colonialism, but also talking about feminism. Because much of what goes on in that novel has to do with both of these things, which also means, and this may help to clarify things a little bit further, that also means that there sometimes will be a certain overlap of these issues. So that you could be taking a novel, and I've given you a couple of examples already, you could be taking a novel in which there's more than one thematic focus. So that the novel might very much be an examination of certain experiences and attitudes towards women, and at the same time also have to do with, say, industrialism. Dickens' Hard Times, which we're going to be taking up shortly, you could very easily look at Hard Times in that way. It is, from one point of view, a critique of the Industrial Revolution, at least its darker side, in places like Coketown, the imaginary Coketown of England, a mining town in England. But at the same time, you have a lot going on there which has to do with male-female relationships, women's roles, women's identities, and so forth, over against and in relation to men's roles and men's identities. So that it would be entirely possible with that same novel to move either in one direction or in the other, so that your primary focus may want to be on one of these topics, though you may along the way want to acknowledge the existence of other thematic elements. Is that clear? Okay, and remember now, and I'm going to be going through the issues one by one here this evening. And if need be, because this is so important to us, if need be, if we don't get everything in tonight, we'll just carry over a little bit into our next class. So we're going to have lots of time for discussing this. And every class from now on, if you want to bring up questions about paper topics, please do so that we can work towards clarifying all of these things. And of course, you can always talk to me outside of class. And for those of you who are taking this course at a distance, you can always email me or my assistant instructor in the class. So, okay. Any other questions before we move on? Remember now that I'm asking for a three-part paper. A three-part paper. These will not be equal parts, but three-part paper. The first part of your paper, and since we're talking about something 8 to 10 pages long, roughly, and I've said here before, I don't count words. Believe it or not, I actually have other things to do in my life than count words in student papers. So this is just to give you a kind of rough idea of what I'm looking for. An 8 to 10 page double-spaced printed paper in which you first of all explain the historical context within which the literary work that you have chosen is created, focusing particularly on those elements of the context, the historical context, that will apply to your analysis of the novel. And then secondly, you will do an analysis of the novel in terms of its representation, its dealing with one of these four general topic areas. And then you will conclude your paper with a paragraph in which you offer your judgment of the contribution that your author has made to our understanding of that topic. And I'm not trying to give you a formula, but I would say that the first part, where you establish the historical context, would probably be somewhere between a page and a half and 2.5 pages. But again, I'm not trying to give you a formula, and you may find with a particular topic that you need to treat that a little bit differently than just to count the number of words and number of pages. Then that would mean that the longest section in your paper would be the middle one, in which you would probably be devoting somewhere between 5 and 6 pages or thereabouts to the analysis, a detailed analysis, in which you would be drawing my attention to specific things in the novel, specific characters, actions, speeches, and so forth, that were relevant to your discussion. And then you conclude with really a single paragraph is probably all that it would take. Okay? Yeah, go ahead.
You say here footnotes or endnotes. Would a works cited page be sufficient? Or
Yeah, a works cited page is usually sufficient if you give a reference. I mean, like, let's say you're going along and you're talking about Dickens' Hard Times, okay? And let's say that you have looked at a biography of Charles Dickens. I mean, after all, you're going to have to go to some secondary sources to find out information about your author and your author's life and times, right? So unless you just happen to have in your attic access to original materials, a trunk full of letters that Dickens wrote, or something or other like that. You're going to have to go to some kind of secondary sources. So, and I'm not trying to make this into a research paper, but you'll have to go to one or more secondary sources just in order to find out some stuff about your writer and his or her life and times. Okay. And let's say you were writing about Dickens and you made reference to a standard biography. And you could say something to the effect of, as so-and-so, Joseph Smith says in, his book, blah, 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 and his biography of Dickens, blah, 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 blah. And then in parentheses, at the end of your quotation or your paraphrase, you could simply put the page numbers, right? The reference to the page numbers. And then in a work cited, you would give the full bibliographical reference to that work. Now, I'm not a stickler about the forms for documentation. I just insist that you use some clear form for documenting your use of sources. So that if you want to use footnotes, that's perfectly fine with me. If you want to use endnotes, that's perfectly fine with me. If you want to use internal forms of documentation, which refer then to fuller bibliographical information in works cited at the end of the paper, that's fine with me. If you're an English or foreign language student, you probably will want to use the MLA style sheet. If you haven't learned it already, you will need to know that sooner or later in your courses in the English department or one of the foreign languages. If you're a social science major, it's perfectly fine for you to use the APA or American Psychological Association form. It's perfectly good. They're both very good. The University of Chicago style is the one that's used by many, many publishers, and that's also very good. Any clear form for documentation is fine. Okay? All right. Well, any questions just about how to handle the paper itself? Well, let's get into talking about the topics. And we can go to the PowerPoint, please. Okay. So here we are. First of all, evolution. In earlier editions of the Norton Anthology, this used to be called Evolution in Science, or sometimes Religion in Science, and so forth. But anyway, evolution. The reason why I put up here Lyell's Principles of Geology, published in 1830, is to make the point that the discussion did not really begin with Darwin alone, that there were other scientists who already were raising certain kinds of questions that were objected to, even raising the questions, by the way, much less the answers, by certain people on religious grounds. And we're going to talk about that now in some detail. For example, there were many, not everybody of course, but there were many who accepted the view in earlier times, and I mean up through and including the 18th and 19th centuries, as articulated by Bishop Ussher in England, a guy named Bishop Ussher in England, that you could calculate on the basis of analysis of the Bible the exact time from creation to the present. The exact time. And so what Bishop Ussher and other scholars had done is they had gone through the Bible, beginning with the stories of creation, and they had looked for chronological references and simply did the arithmetic. And what they came up with was that the period from creation to the time of Christ, or the birth of Christ, say, was, and I don't have the exact number in front of me, but it was around 4,000 years. And then let's say you add whatever number of years since then, so, 6,000 years or something or other like that. And you would have the age of the universe. Okay? Well, some scientists were very, very doubtful about that. But in general, many scientists simply didn't want to rock the boat. We all remember the story of Galileo. And when Galileo started publishing some of his observations, his astronomical observations and theories, not in Latin, simply for fellow scholars, but in Italian, where they could be read by all kinds of people, rather than simply the scholars and fellow scientists. And the church stepped in and said, well, wait a minute now, what you're saying runs counter to church teaching, and Galileo got himself into big-time trouble at a time when getting in trouble with the church, whatever the church happened to be, could really land you in very, very serious difficulties. House arrest would be perhaps the least of your worries, and you could very well be sent to prison. And in some places, there was what the Portuguese called the auto da fe, in which people were tortured and even burned at the stake. And that happened in various parts of Europe. And it wasn't simply one religious group, it was various religious groups that carried out those kinds of horrors. So, obviously, if you were a scientist who felt that there were things that you had discovered or other scientists had discovered that ran counter to the teachings of the religious community within which you lived, you might want to be very cautious. On the other hand, the usual view was that everything we learn from science actually confirms what the teachers and preachers of religion tell us, at least in certain ways. So that if we go back into the 18th century, and some of you know what I'm talking about because you've studied this, I know some of you have studied this with me, you can find works like Alexander Pope's long philosophical poem, The Essay on Man, in which he really makes the argument that Newton was a theologian who made his greatest contribution to theology with his scientific work, because what Newton was to establish the physical laws of the universe in such a way as to demonstrate how the universe was perfectly ordered. And from that, according to not only Pope, but people like Paley, who wrote a book called Natural Theology that was a big seller in the 18th century and very influential, and lots of others, from that orderly universe that Newton and others had discovered, or believed that they had discovered, one could infer the necessity of a divine orderer. In other words, that this kind of intricate order could not have come about by chance. That there had to be some kind of orderly plan and design on such a scale that it would require a transcendent intelligence, an all-knowing and all-powerful God to have created this kind of a universe. Okay, so notice that was an effort in the 18th century to reconcile any potential dispute between religion and science or philosophy. Well, then along comes Lyell with his principles of geology, and he says, based on geological research, where you actually go and you look in places at the different levels of the development of the earth. And there are places where obviously you can do this, right? Sheared off mountains or cliffs and so forth, where probably many of you have actually seen this, where you can see different sedimentary layers that were created over very, very long periods of time. And Lyell didn't have it right, but he was on the right track in saying that planet Earth had to be at least hundreds of thousands of years old. We now know that it was actually millions of years old, or it is millions of years old. But Lyell at least was on the right track. And subsequent scientific research has established with greater accuracy these figures. Well, you can imagine that Lyell raised quite a stir, because here were people who were going around simply saying, well, the Earth is only, a few thousand years old, and we can establish this on the basis of biblical chronology. And on the other hand, here's Lyell and his fellow scientists and students saying, it's very clear on the basis of our scientific research that that is not the case. Okay, at the time that Lyell and a little bit later on Darwin were doing their work, in order to get sponsorship from the British Academy of Science, which endorsed scientific research projects, in order to get their endorsement, one of the things that you had to do was you had to establish, or you had to propose to establish, how your research was going to contribute to traditional theological beliefs. That was one of the requirements. I don't know if any of you have ever filled out a grant application, but if you fill out a grant application to try to get some kind of a research grant or maybe a student grant, there are certain things that questions that you have to answer, right? So what I'm saying here is that one of the questions that a scientist would have to answer is how his or her research was going to further our understanding of the traditional teachings of theology, which of course meant Christian theology. Okay? Now, that's the kind of cultural world that we're operating in. So that when Darwin came along with his Origin of the Species, and then later on, even more spectacularly, with his Descent of Man, what he did was he touched a kind of nerve that was even more sensitive than Lyell had. I mean, Lyell had said, well, look, the Earth is a lot older than we thought. And there are people who are sort of scratching their heads and saying, well, okay, maybe we need to rethink, this whole business of biblical chronology. Okay? But that didn't fundamentally upset the whole theological cart. Unless, of course, one was a literalist in the reading of the Bible, which, of course, some people were and are. Okay, but look at what Darwin was saying. Darwin was saying, not only have all species not been created at once, all existing species were not all created at once at the moment of creation by God in their present form, but they got to where they are through a process of what he called evolution. And in that process, some species did not survive. Other species survived by changing to adapt themselves to the circumstances in which they lived, and those circumstances were often changing. over time. Now, traditional theological teaching at this time was that whenever the creation occurred, God created everything in its present form all at once, in one moment. Clearly, evolutionary theory went against that teaching. Secondly, even more horrifying to many people in the Victorian world was Darwin's claim that we human beings actually evolved out of lower forms of life. And most people not only couldn't get their brains around that, but they just totally were scandalized by that notion, because it ran counter to all of our religious and philosophical traditions in the West. And one might argue beyond the West, but I'm confining myself to the West here because that's what we're dealing with. Okay, so what did Darwin actually say? Well, let's look. Open your book. Let's look. The very beginning of the origin of the species. By the way, you know, Darwin's one of those interesting figures whom everybody's got some opinion about, or at least a lot of people have some idea or opinion about. How many people have actually read Darwin? Darwin's a very, very interesting writer and very interesting thinker. I have in the past taught a course in the literature of science, in which what I've taught are all scientific writings, and looked at them with the eye of a literary critic. And it's very interesting. You know, Darwin was a very, very complex and interesting writer as well as thinker. We will now discuss in a little more detail than he had, you know, up to this point. We're actually beginning in the middle of the work. The struggle for existence. Nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life. Universal struggle for life. Okay? Each individual species is struggling to stay alive, and in some cases it's struggling with other species in its effort to stay alive. This is not the kind of world that many people wanted to envision. This is a world that, in the words of the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson, was a nature red in tooth and claw. And we'll see with what consequences for many people in the Victorian age. So nothing is easier than to admit in words the truth of the universal struggle for life, or more difficult, at least I have found it so, than constantly to bear this conclusion in mind, unless it be thoroughly ingrained in the mind, the whole economy of nature, with every fact on distribution, rarity, abundance, extinction, and variation, will be dimly seen or quite misunderstood. We behold the face of nature bright with gladness. Remember Wordsworth? We often see superabundance of food. We do not see, or we forget, that the birds which are idly singing around us mostly live on insects or seeds, and are thus constantly destroying life. Or we forget how largely these songsters, or their eggs, or their nestlings, are destroyed by birds and beasts of prey. We do not always bear in mind that, though food may be now superabundant, it is not so at all seasons of each recurring year. And so he goes on. I should premise that I use this term in a large and metaphorical sense. That's interesting. That just absolutely knocked me off my pins when I first read Darwin saying not only here that he's using some of his terms in a metaphorical sense, but later on in The Descent of Man, when he talks about natural selection, he said, you know, I don't understand what the fuss is about because people are taking literally my understanding of natural selection when I really meant that as a metaphor. And you go, a metaphor? My God, what is he talking about? It's an interesting guy. So I use this term in a large and metaphorical sense, including dependence of one being on another, and including, which is more important, not only the life of the individual, but success in leaving progeny. Two canine animals in a time of dearth may be truly said to struggle with each other, which shall get food and live. And he goes on and on and on and on with that sort of thing. Okay? Now, you can imagine how there were certain people who took over this kind of thinking and applied it to society, and the functioning of social systems, so that what Darwin is ultimately going to be working towards here is his theory that there is survival of the fittest. You know, the famous phrase, the survival of the fittest. So that those who are most fit are those species which can adapt to altered circumstances, especially endangering circumstances, and are most fit to do that adapting, and therefore they survive. Now, there were people in the 19th century, and of course this is carried on through the 20th century down to our own time, who applied that kind of thinking to society and came up with what is called, if we can go to the tablet, please. Let's see if we can do this, okay. Social Darwinism. And social Darwinism holds that people thrown into social conflict in which everybody is competing for everybody else, with everybody else, and there may even be somewhat limited resources, that those who are fittest to survive will not only survive, but thrive. So that the reason why there are some people who are more wealthy than others, let's say, is that they are more fit to adapt to the economic realities of the social environment than those people who have much less in terms of spendable income, or perhaps very little at all. And notice that where this really gets harsh is when you begin to talk about people who are living in poverty. Social Darwinism would hold that the reason why poor people are poor is that that is simply of the very nature of things. You see, that there are simply people who don't have the skills or the abilities to give them the kind of fitness to survive and to flourish that others do. So notice that that leads to a very kind of harsh social system and a very unforgiving kind of social system. And that has been at different times in the 19th and 20th centuries a political force in one country or part of the world or another. Okay, let's move over a little bit to the Descent of Man, the selection we have from the Descent of Man. I want to draw your attention to two passages. This is far along in the work where we begin. And what he's doing, fortunately for us, is providing us with a summary of the argument. A brief summary will here be sufficient to recall to the reader's mind the more salient points in this work. Many of the views which have been advanced are highly speculative, and some, no doubt, will prove erroneous. But I have in every case given the reasons which have led me to one view rather than to another. It seemed worthwhile, notice he's establishing his scientific method and the credibility of his scientific approach to the problems he has dealt with. It seemed worthwhile to try how far the principle of evolution would throw light on some of the more complex problems in the natural history of man. Natural history meaning the physical history, as distinguished from something like, say, political history or social history and so on. False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often long endure. But false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, as everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. And when this is done, one path toward error is closed, and the road to truth is often at the same time opened. Okay, so notice that this serves a rhetorical function, this opening paragraph, in which he's establishing not only the credibility of his method as a scientist, but in a larger sense, his credibility as a scientist. The main conclusion arrived at in this work, and now held by many naturalists, naturalist was the 19th century word for scientist, who are well competent to form a sound judgment, is that man is descended from some less highly organized form. From some less highly organized form. Now, remember that this work was done about 12 years after the origin of the species. So the origin of the species had been around, and at least people in the scientific community were quite familiar with it and had an opportunity to think about it, to talk about it, to argue about it, to test some of the evidence, to question some of the arguments in that work. And this is what he says now has happened. The grounds upon which this conclusion rests will never be shaken, for the close similarity between man and the lower animals in embryonic development, as well as in innumerable points of structure and constitution, both of high and of the most trifling importance, the rudiments which he retains, and the abnormal reversions to which he is occasionally liable, are facts which cannot be disputed. By the way, no scientist would write a sentence like that nowadays. But Darwin, like everybody else in his time, had a literary education. I mean, you would have a literary education based on the classics, whether you ultimately went into business or science or, whatever. They have long been known, but until recently, they told us nothing with respect to the origin of man. Now, when viewed by the light of our knowledge of the whole organic world, little presumptuous, as we would now say, but the whole organic world, at least as it was understood in Darwin's time, their meaning is unmistakable. The great principle of evolution stands up clear and firm when these groups of facts are considered in connection with others, such as the mutual affinities of the members of the same group, their geographical distribution in past and present times, and their geological succession. It is incredible that all these facts should speak falsely. He who is not content to look like a savage, in other words, anybody who doesn't agree with me is not going to look at facts like a scientist, but rather like a savage. He who is not content to look like a savage at the phenomena of nature as disconnected cannot any longer believe that man is the work of a separate act of creation. Remember, that's what I said earlier? The belief that human beings were created separately from other species, and that all species were created at once as separate and distinct species by God. He will be forced to admit that the close resemblance of the embryo of man to that, for instance, of a dog, the construction of his skull, limbs, and whole frame, independently of the uses to which the parts may be put, on the same plan with that of other mammals, the occasional appearance of various structures, for instance, of several distinct muscles, which man does not normally possess, but which are common to the quadrumana, and a crowd of analogous facts, all point in the plainest manner to the conclusion that man is the co-descendant with other mammals of a common progenitor. Now, what does that clause mean? You see, that we human beings are co-descendants with other mammals from a common progenitor. Okay? Now, that's a very, very, very striking claim. Well, let's turn over a page or so and look at his conclusion. This is the final two paragraphs. The main conclusion arrived at in this work, namely that man is descended from some lowly organized form, will, I regret to think, be highly distasteful to many persons. The astonishment, he's going to now give a personal anecdote, by the way, about his own experience. We're going to come back to this later on. The astonishment which I felt on first seeing a party of Fuegians, you know, he went to Tierra del Fuego, which is, where is that? Yeah, where in southern? Yeah, it's way down. Yeah, southern tip. Yeah. Okay. The astonishment which I felt on first seeing a party of Fuegians on a wild and broken shore will never be forgotten by me, for the reflection at once rushed into my mind, such were our ancestors. This goes back to an earlier idea that you find in the end of the 18th century and during the 19th century, that there are different races of human beings which really amounted to different subspecies, and that some were more advanced or less advanced than others. And that was a very commonly held idea, even among scientists in the 19th century. And of course, among some on into the 20th century, and was used, by the way, to justify all kinds of racist oppression and so forth. For the reflection at once rushed into my mind, such were our ancestors. See, it's not, these are my cousins. These are my ancestors. This is the stage out of which I now have evolved into a higher order of being. These men were absolutely naked and bedaubed with paint. Their long hair was tangled, their mouths frothed with excitement, and their expression was wild, startled, and distrustful. You wonder if he ever talked to any of them. Did he learn their language? Did he try to find out what they thought? What kinds of ideas they had, or what kinds of stories they told? What kinds of beliefs they had? They possessed hardly any arts, and like wild animals lived on what they could catch. They had no government, and were merciless to everyone not of their own small tribe. He who is seen a savage in his native land will not feel much shame if forced to acknowledge that the blood of some more humble creature flows in his veins. A savage in his native land. Okay. For my own part, I would as soon be descended from that heroic little monkey who braved his dreaded enemy in order to save the life of his keeper, or from that old baboon who, descending from the mountains, carried away in triumph his young comrade from a crowd of astonished dogs, as from a savage who delights to torture his enemies, offers up bloody sacrifices, practices infanticide without remorse, treats his wives like slaves, knows no decency, and is haunted by the grossest superstitions. Man may be excused for feeling some pride at having risen, though not through his own exertions, to the very summit of the organic scale. And the fact of his having thus risen, instead of having been aboriginally placed there, may give him hopes for a still higher destiny in the distant future. I mean, after all, why should we think that evolution is going to stop here? I mean, there's absolutely no basis whatsoever. You know, I mean, if evolution is what got us here to this point, why should we conclude that evolution is now going to stop, that we've reached the end point? But we are not here concerned with hopes or fears, only with the truth as far as our reason allows us to discover it. I have given the evidence to the best of my ability, and we must acknowledge, as it seems to me, that man with all his noble qualities, with sympathy which he feels for the most debased, with benevolence which extends not only to other men but to the humblest living creature, with his godlike intellect which has penetrated into the movements and constitution of the solar system. With all these exalted powers, man still bears in his bodily frame the indelible stamp of his lowly origin. Well, okay. Darwin. Very, very interesting guy. Okay, let's see what kind of debate did this actually inspire in the 19th century. The next selection we have in our text is from Leonard Huxley, who was the son of the great Thomas Henry Huxley, who was a scholar and scientist, a biologist, by the way, and man of letters or person of letters in the 19th century, and a great intellectual and thinker, and somebody who had tremendous influence through his writings in the latter part of the 19th century and on into the early part of the 20th century. There's a whole line of Huxleys, by the way, who have been very distinguished writers and thinkers and scientists and so forth in England. Okay, here's Thomas Henry Huxley. And his son, because there were only some newspaper accounts and so forth, and no doubt his father's reflections to work with, his son had undertaken to write a biography of his famous father. And Huxley was very, very famous in his time. And talks in particular about a meeting that took place in the University of Oxford in 1860. Now, this would have been very shortly after the publication of The Origin of the Species. And in this debate, there clearly are going to be those who are arguing on behalf of Darwin and Darwin's findings and Darwin's theories, and there are going to be those who will argue against. And those who are arguing against, in particular, were doing so on religious grounds. And so, after some initial speakers, this huge crowd that had packed into a room so that it was really almost suffocating, was demanding that the principals get up and address the crowd. And so Bishop Wilberforce, who was very, very well known at his time, a great ecclesiastical orator and a great rhetorician and a great defender of traditional religious beliefs, Bishop Wilberforce got up, and let's see what he had to say. This is about 2 pages into the work. The bishop spoke for full half an hour with inimitable spirit, emptiness, and unfairness. Okay? Isn't that interesting? Spoke for a full half an hour with inimitable spirit, and then we're expecting something else in what follows. Emptiness and unfairness. In a light, scoffing tone, florid and fluent, he assured us that there was nothing in the idea of evolution. Rock pigeons were what rock pigeons had always been. Then, turning to his antagonist, with a smiling insolence, he begged to know, was it through his grandfather or his grandmother that he claimed his descent from a monkey? This was the fatal mistake of his speech. Huxley instantly grasped the tactical advantage which the descent to personalities gave him. Descent to personalities, the ad hominem attack. Everybody knows what I'm talking about with that, right? You don't know what I'm talking about? Okay. Well, let's go back to the tablet, please. Are we back to the tablet? Okay, great. Okay, there are various things that are called fallacies in argument, okay, fallacious forms of reasoning. One of them is the attack or argument ad hominem. Anybody know what that means? Ad hominem? Against the man, against the person. Against the person. Okay? So if you attack the person rather than deal with the issue, that is an ad hominem attack. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? In a time of political elections. Ad hominem attacks flying everywhere. Well, okay. So that's what happens here. This was the fatal mistake of his speech. Huxley instantly grasped the tactical advantage which the descent to personalities gave him. He turned to Sir Benjamin Brodie, who was sitting beside him, and emphatically striking his hand upon his knee, exclaimed, "The Lord hath delivered him into mine hands." The bearing of the exclamation did not dawn upon Sir Benjamin until after Huxley had completed his forcible and eloquent answer to the scientific part of the bishop's argument and proceeded to make his famous retort. See, first of all, what Huxley did was he went through the scientific part of the bishop's presentation and simply showed where he was wrong. I mean, the bishop did not know his science, and Huxley did. And then he proceeded to make his famous retort. On this, continues the writer in Macmillan's magazine, Mr. Huxley slowly and deliberately arose, a slight, tall figure, stern and pale, very quiet and very grave. He stood before us and spoke those tremendous words, words which no one seems sure of now, nor, I think, could remember just after they were spoken, for their meaning took away our breath, though it left us in no doubt as to what it was. He was not ashamed to have a monkey for his ancestor, but he would be ashamed to be connected with a man who used great gifts to obscure the truth. No one doubted his meaning, and the effect was tremendous. One lady fainted and had to be carried out. I, for one, jumped out of my seat. And of course, what happened as a consequence is that the people who were there regarded Huxley as having totally defeated Wilberforce in this debate. And Huxley went on, by the way, to become such an advocate of Darwinian theory and Darwinian science that he came to be nicknamed Darwin's Bulldog. Darwin's Bulldog. Well, okay. I said that this kind of thing continued for a very long time. Well, think about the famous Scopes trial in the United States, when Scopes, a biology teacher in high school in a town in Tennessee, was not only fired by the school board for teaching the theory of evolution in his classroom, but then there was the famous court trial, in which Clarence Darrow was the person who presented the case for Scopes, and of course did an absolutely brilliant job. And so think about the fact that there are people even today who go to school board meetings or to the Board of Education in Austin and who argue against having science textbooks which present the theory of evolution. Okay? Yeah, or who argue at the very least that if you're going to have evolution presented in the textbook, you also have the traditional religious Christian interpretation of creation and the biblical story of creation presented side by side with the theory of evolution. So what I'm saying is that the debate is not really over, but it's a debate that continues, at least in some quarters, down to the present time. And it's not confined to the question of evolution alone, but we could extend that to other areas of science as well. So, okay, let's move right along here to talk about the second one of our major topics: industrialism, progress, or decline. Well, one of the principal texts that we have here is by Thomas Babington Macaulay, who was a very, very famous writer and thinker of the Victorian period. And he wrote a review of a book in which he was going to be arguing, counter to the argument in the book under review, he was going to be arguing, in effect, that all is well with the world, that we were on track, that the Industrial Revolution was bringing all of the greatest of benefits to humankind, and that we could look forward to unlimited progress in the future, okay, essentially through the system of industrial capitalism. And some of his arguments, of course, one still can hear today. Okay, turn over about 3 pages into the work. I say that only because I know people are dealing with different editions. If you have the 7th edition, which is the one I'm using right now, this is on page 1700. Okay? It is not strange that, differing so widely from Mr. Southey, Southey, by the way, was a Romantic poet. And in the book that Macaulay was reviewing, Southey had been arguing, as other Romantics often had been arguing, that industrialization and urbanization were really destroying our world, and that we would be better to roll back history to an earlier time. It is not strange that, differing so widely from Mr. Southey as to the past progress of society, we should differ from him also as to its probable destiny. He thinks that to all outward appearance, the country is hastening to destruction. But he relies firmly on the goodness of God. We do not see either the piety or the rationality of thus confidently expecting that the Supreme Being will interfere to disturb the common succession of causes and effects. We too rely on his goodness as manifested not in extraordinary interpositions, but in those general laws which it has pleased him to establish in the physical and in the moral world. See, what he's doing is he's going to be arguing from religion, from the goodness of God's order and design. We rely on the natural tendency of the human intellect to truth, and on the natural tendency of society to improvement. Well, now, isn't that interesting? The natural tendency of the human intellect to truth, and on the natural tendency of society to improvement. Well, would we necessarily agree with Macaulay that these are natural? That is to say, that it's of the very nature of human beings to tend in these ways? We know no well-authenticated instance of a people which has decidedly retrograded in civilization and prosperity, except from the influence of violent and terrible calamities, such as those which laid the Roman Empire in ruins, or those about the beginning of the 16th century, which desolated Italy. We know of no country which at the end of 50 years of peace and tolerably good government has been less prosperous than at the beginning of that period. And so what he's going to be arguing for is that progress is something that is going to be directed by the divine hand, and therefore it must be essentially good. So look at the next paragraph. History is full of the signs of this natural progress of society. We see in almost every part of the annals of mankind how the industry of individuals struggling up against wars, taxes, famines, conflagrations, mischievous prohibitions, and more mischievous protections creates faster than government can squander and repairs whatever invaders can destroy. We see the wealth of nations increasing and all the arts of life approaching nearer and nearer to perfection, in spite of the grossest corruption and the wildest profusion on the part of rulers. Well, that's a very, very optimistic view of history, isn't it? And then look at the last paragraph. It is not by the intermeddling of Mr. Southey's idol, the omniscient and omnipotent state, but by the prudence and energy of the people, that England has hitherto been carried forward in civilization, and it is to the same prudence and the same energy that we now look with comfort and good hope. Our rulers will best promote the improvement of the nation by strictly confining themselves to their own legitimate duties, by leaving capital to find its most lucrative course, commodities their fair price, industry and intelligence their natural reward, idleness and folly their natural punishment, by maintaining peace, by defending property, by diminishing the price of law, and by observing strict economy in every department of the state. Let the government do this, the people will assuredly do the rest. Well, if you were wondering where that kind of thinking came from, it came from people like Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations at the end of the 18th century, and it was promoted by people like Thomas Babington Macaulay in very famous publications, such as the one that we have just been reading. But this is a kind of thinking and a kind of rhetoric that is still very, very much with us today. And as a matter of fact, all you have to do is turn on the television set, and you can hear these same phrases, coming out of the mouths of some of our political leaders. Okay, well, let's take a break now, and then we'll come back to the critique.